tide was going out at Waikawau on the morning of the 11th of March, 1919, and the sand was that hard grey colour it takes on when the water has just left it, still holding the light like wet slate. Alfred Cudmore had walked that stretch of the Coromandel coast perhaps 400 times in his life. He was 38 years old, a surveyor's assistant by trade and a photographer by obsession, and he was carrying 11 kilograms of equipment on his back because he had come to photograph the rock stacks at the northern end of the bay in the low morning sun. He never reached the rock stacks. What he saw first, he said afterwards, was not the bird. What he saw first was the wrongness of the driftwood. There was a shape at the high water line, perhaps 90 yards ahead of him, that his eye had already filed as a piece of storm-thrown timber, one of those bleached kauri limbs that come down the rivers and lie on the beaches for years. And then the timber moved, not the way a floating thing moves in shallow water. It moved the way a body moves. It resettled itself, shifted its mass from one point of contact to another, and lifted something at the top of it that was not a branch. He stopped walking. He wrote later that he did not decide to stop. His legs simply ceased. Understand the light he was standing in. Sunrise at that latitude on that date was 5:48. He judged the time at a little after 7. The sun was behind him and low, coming over the ridge at his back, and it was throwing his own shadow ahead of him down the wet sand, which means the thing at the high water line was fully lit, front on in flat, clean, early light with no haze. He was not squinting into glare. He was not looking through spray. He had the best light a photographer on that coast can ever hope for, and he was looking at something he could not name. It was standing. That was the first fact he fixed on, and he came back to it again and again in every account he ever gave. It was standing on 2 legs, on the sand, and it was taller than he was. He put it later at 7 feet and some inches at the crown of the head. And he was a man who measured things for a living, who had spent his working life with a chain and a level, whose entire professional worth rested on his ability to judge a distance and a height. He gave that figure, and he never revised it. The legs were the part that frightened him. He said they were bare and grey and scaled like a rooster's leg magnified past reason, and that the bones of them were wrong, that the drumstick was too long and the shank too short, so that the thing's knees seemed to sit high and far back, tucked up under a body carried horizontally like a barrel slung between 2 posts. The feet he described in detail, because he was standing on wet sand and he could see the prints. 3 forward toes and something behind. The forward toes he estimated at 9 to 10 inches from the joint to the nail. He said the nails were dark and dull and turned down at the tip, and that they had dug furrows in the sand as the animal shifted its weight, and that the furrows were as deep as a man's finger. Above the legs, the body. He called it barrel-chested, deep through the breast, and covered not in the smooth-laid feathers of a seabird, but in something coarser and looser. Hair, he wrote first. Then struck it out and wrote hair-like plumes, then struck that out too. In the end, he settled on the word shaggy. A shaggy brown-black mass, wet along the flanks where the animal had come up out of the surf or lain in it, and lighter, almost grey fawn, along the underside and the throat, and then the neck and the head. And this is where every account of that morning stops being strange and becomes something else. The neck was long. Longer, he said, than a swan's, and thicker, and it did not curve gracefully. It came up out of the shoulders in a heavy S, and then straightened, and when the animal straightened it fully, the head cleared the top of a fence post. The head itself he described as small in proportion, flattened, and the beak as short, deep, and hooked, not the long straight probe of a wading bird, not the spear of a heron. A hook, a heavy down-curved hook, pale at the base and darker at the point, set in a face he said had no expression in it at all. And it looked at him. That is the sentence he underlined, in the only surviving letter in his own hand. It looked at me. It did not startle, it did not run, it did not spread anything. It turned that flattened head on that long neck, and it put one eye on me, and it held me there, and I understood in that moment that it was not afraid, and that it was working out what I was. He had the camera off his back and on the sand in under a minute. A half-plate field camera, mahogany and brass, on a wooden tripod. He had to open one leg at a time with one hand, while the other held the plate holder against his chest. He said his hands were steady. He said he was surprised by how steady his hands were. He focused on the ground glass, upside down and reversed, watching that inverted grey shape stand motionless in his frame, and he thought, these are his words, that if it moved before the slide was out, he would lose it forever, and no one on earth would ever believe a word he said. It did not move. He drew the dark slide. He made one exposure at something between a 15th and a 25th of a second, at what he later reckoned as F11. One plate, one. Then he reached for the second holder, and the animal decided. He said it did not fly. That is the detail that has kept this case alive for 106 years, and it is the detail that ruins every easy explanation of it. It did not fly. It dropped its head, swung that heavy neck forward like a man leaning into a load, and it ran north up the beach into the shallow water at the mouth of the stream, and it ran the way an ostrich runs, in long shearing strides that threw water above the height of its own back. He counted, he said, 3 seconds of running. He said the sound of it reached him after the sight of it, and that the sound was not a bird's cry. It was a low double note, twice, like a man blowing across the neck of a bottle, and then the far side of the stream mouth, and the flax and the manuka, and nothing. He was alone on that beach at 7 in the morning with one exposed plate in a wooden holder, a set of footprints in the sand that the returning tide would erase within 4 hours, and a story that would take from him, over the following 11 years, his employment, his standing, and very nearly his mind. The plate survived. I have seen what became of it. The bird did not. Now I want to slow down, because the next part of this story is where the record either holds or falls apart, and I have spent a great deal of time inside it. His name was Alfred Ernest Wilmot. He was 34 years old in the spring of 1919, and he was not a naturalist, not an explorer, not a man with a book to sell. He was an assistant surveyor with the Lands and Survey Department, seconded that season to the Westland District, working the coastal traverse north of the Waikawau River, a stretch of shingle, driftwood, black sand and river mouths between Ross and Aboot Head, on the west coast of the South Island, at roughly 43 degrees 15 minutes south. That is a hard coast. It faces the whole width of the Tasman Sea, and it takes the weather without any land to break it. Even now, in a country of 4 million people and endless roads, there are stretches of that shore where you can walk for half a day and see no structure of any kind. In 1919, the nearest settlement of consequence was a scatter of sawmill and gold-sluicing families, and the nearest telegraph office was 9 miles inland. The camera was a quarter-plate field camera, mahogany and brass, a Thornton Pickard shutter, and it was not his. It belonged to the department. He carried it because the traverse required photographic records of river mouths and changing shorelines, routine work, the sort of survey photography that filled thousands of glass plates in New Zealand's public archives in that decade and fills them still. And this is the part I want you to hold on to, because it matters more than any other fact in this episode. The plate he exposed that morning was departmental property, on a departmental plate, in a departmental holder, with a departmental serial notation scratched into the emulsion margin. He did not go looking for a monster with his own camera. He was at work. The image entered a government filing system before anyone had decided what it was. He returned to the field camp at Kakapotahi that evening, and he told 2 men. One was a chainman named Rangi Tatana, whose name appears in the Traverse Party list, and who, in the only interview he ever gave about it, to a Greymouth paper in 1932, 13 years later, said something that has stayed with me for months. He did not say he believed Wilmot. He said, We did not need to be told there were things in that country. He said his grandmother's people had a name for a bird on that coast that stood taller than a man and would not be seen twice by the same person. He would not repeat the name to the reporter. He said it was not his to give away. The other man Wilmot told was the party leader, a surveyor named H.J. Cawthron, and Cawthron did the thing that a certain kind of methodical man does when confronted with the impossible. He wrote it down. There is a field notebook, and I want to be exact here because this is the closest thing this case has to bedrock, held in the Lands and Survey deposits at Archives New Zealand in Wellington in the Westland District series, a run of survey field books from that season. In one of them, at the entry for the 12th of October 1919, in Cawthron's hand, in pencil, between a bearing and a note about a washed-out benchmark, there are 4 lines that read as follows. Wilmot reports large flightless bird near stream mouth 0700 hours, states height 8 feet or over. Exposed 1 plate. I have not seen it myself. Recommend plate be developed at Hokitika and forwarded. That is all. 29 words. No wonder, no excitement, no theory. A recommendation about a plate. I want to be honest with you about what that notebook line does and does not prove. It does not prove there was a bird. It proves, on the day, in a working document that had no reason to lie and no audience to impress, that a man reported one and that his superior treated the report as a procedural matter requiring the development of a plate. Nothing more, but nothing less either. And in a field where almost everything arrives to us as recollection written down decades later, polished by retelling, a contemporaneous pencil line in a government field book is a very rare object. It is the difference between a story and a record. The plate went to Hokitika. It was developed on the 15th or 16th of October by a commercial photographer named William Bramley, who ran a portrait studio on Revel Street and who did contract developing for the department because the department had no darkroom of its own on that coast. Bramley developed it, made 2 contact prints on gelatin silver paper, and then, this is documented in his own ledger, which survives in a private collection in Christchurch and which I have seen photographs of, he charged the department 1 shilling and 6pence, and beside the entry he wrote 3 words that I find harder to dismiss than any eyewitness statement in this entire case. Subject unknown. Query. Bramley was a professional. He had been developing plates for 22 years. He photographed weddings, dead children in their coffins, mine shafts, sawmill crews, drowned men laid out on tables. He was not a credulous man, and he had no stake in this. And when the negative came up in the tray, he wrote in his accounts that he did not know what he was looking at. So, what was on it? I have to describe it to you from 3 sources because the original negative's fate is the whole second half of this story, and I will not get ahead of myself. The 3 sources are Wilmot's own written description, submitted with the plate in a 2-page report, the recollection of a Canterbury Museum assistant named Douglas Ferrier, set down in 1961 in a letter to a colleague, and a single surviving print, or rather a photographic copy of a print, which is the image you have almost certainly seen if you have seen anything at all connected to this case, and which I will come to. The frame is wide and low, sea at the left, breaking in a long white line, wet sand filling the lower third, and on the wet sand the reflected sky, so the bottom of the picture is bright and confusing. Driftwood, a great tangle of it, running diagonally from the lower left, and standing on the sand at slightly right of centre, in 3/4 profile, facing away from the sea, an animal. Its legs are the first thing every witness mentions. Enormously thick, and the thickness is wrong for a bird of that height. The shanks read as heavy, almost mammalian, and they are set well apart. The body is a deep, rounded mass, and the feathering, as far as anyone could ever determine from the grain, is coarse and hanging, like a shaggy coat rather than a plumage, and pale, a dirty greyish white with darker mottling along the flank. The neck rises from the front of the mass, thick at the base and thinning, and it is held not upright, but at a low, forward angle, the way a heron holds its neck when walking. The head is small in proportion. The bill is short, deep, and blunt, and it is dark against the pale head. And there is no wing. That is what Ferrier's letter fixes on 42 years afterwards. There is no wing line, no shoulder break, no folded primaries, nothing on that flank where a wing should sit. He wrote that he had examined it under a loupe for the better part of an hour and that the flank was continuous. Continuous, a bird silhouette without the geometry of a bird. Behind it and above the line of driftwood, there is a fence post. A single split timber post, part of a long collapsed stock fence that ran along that section of coast, and it is visible in other departmental survey plates from that same traverse, the same post, the same lean. That post is why this photograph could not simply be laughed off. Because a post of standard split timber height, set by a farmer in a photograph of known focal length, at a distance that could be calculated from the survey data of the very party that took it, is a measuring stick. And when the department's own draftsman scaled the animal against it in the last week of October 1919, they got a figure that they wrote down twice and initialed, because nobody wanted to be the only man to have written it. 2.5 meters. 8 feet 2 inches at the top of the back, not the head. That figure went to Wellington, and in Wellington, this stopped being a story about a bird. What happened in Wellington is the part of this story that I find hardest to talk about calmly because there is no villain in it. I have looked for one. I have read the internal correspondence of the Department of Lands and Survey for the summer of 1919 and 1920, the head office file series that survives in Archives New Zealand under the Lands and Survey Record Group, and I have looked for the memorandum that says, suppress this, destroy that, tell the men nothing. It does not exist. What exists instead is worse, in a quiet way. What exists is a series of entirely reasonable decisions made by careful men, each of which, on its own, was the correct decision. The plate arrived in Wellington in the first week of November. It was logged. That is the crucial thing. It was logged, honestly, by a clerk who had no idea what he was handling, and the log entry is why we can still trace it. It went, as anomalous natural history material was supposed to go, across to the Dominion Museum, then on Museum Street, for opinion, and the man whose opinion was sought was almost certainly Hall Jones's colleague in the ornithological line. The correspondence is initialed, not signed, and I will not pretend to a certainty I do not have. Whoever he was, he did his job. He looked at a photograph of an animal with no wing, and he wrote back that a bird cannot exist without a wing, that the pale coarse covering was consistent with a wet fleece, and that in his considered view, the department was in possession of a photograph of a large stranded pinniped, an elephant seal, most probably a bull, out of season and out of range, but not impossibly so. And here is the thing I have to say plainly, because I owe you honesty more than I owe you a thrill. That opinion was not stupid. It was not cowardice. It was the single most likely explanation available to a competent man in 1919 who had a soft grey photograph on his desk and a working knowledge of what the world contains. He was doing science exactly as science is supposed to be done. He was declining to invent a monster to explain a smudge. The trouble is, what happened to the object afterwards? Because once the museum opinion was on the file, the photograph stopped being evidence and became an error. It was no longer a document of something unexplained. It was a misidentified seal, and misidentified seals do not get preserved with any particular care. The glass plate was not destroyed. Nobody burned it. It was simply reclassified, moved out of the anomalous material sequence and into the general survey series for the Southland Traverse, where it sat among 400 and some plates of riverbanks, road lines, culverts, and section pegs. That is how a thing disappears in a bureaucracy. Not by fire, by filing. The negative was still there in 1927 because it appears in a stock take. It was still there almost certainly in 1938. And then there is the wartime consolidation and the storage moves and the two floods that everybody who works in New Zealand archives can name, and the periodic culling of duplicate and low-value survey glass to recover space and reduce shelf weight. Glass plates are extraordinarily heavy, and a warehouse floor has a load limit, and a plate labelled as a seal on a beach is precisely the sort of thing a conscientious storeman with a quota culls first. Ferrier, writing in 1961, said he had been told it was gone. He did not say destroyed. He said the words that appear again and again in this kind of search, the flattest and most final words in the language of archives: not located. Go and look. I mean that literally. Archives. New Zealand's collection search is public and free. The lands and survey series are described down to file level and in places to item level. If a plate matching the traverse and the date is sitting there mislabeled, it will be found by somebody who is willing to spend a winter reading item descriptions, and it will not be found by me because I have already spent mine. Now let me give the skeptic his full innings, because he deserves it and because I cannot dismiss him. Southern elephant seals do haul out on the New Zealand mainland. Bulls reach 5 meters and 4 tons. A molting bull is pale, filthy grey-white, blotched and mottled, and its coat hangs in coarse sheets exactly as I described it to you. A resting bull raises its head and foreneck off the sand in a thick tapering column at a low forward angle, and the proboscis on a mature bull is short, deep, blunt and dark against the paler head. There is no wing on the flank because there is no wing on a seal, and every measurement problem I have raised against the skeptic, he answers with one word: distance. Move the animal 3 meters nearer the camera than the fence post, and 8 feet 2 inches becomes 5 feet, and 5 feet on a Southland beach in 1919 is a Wednesday. I find that persuasive. I want you to hear me say it without hedging. It explains the covering, the colour, the head, the neck, the bill, the absent wing, and it explains the museum's opinion, and it explains why nobody in Wellington panicked. It is a complete explanation, and it requires nothing new in the world. It leaves two things standing. The first is the men. 4 of them on a survey party whose trade was measuring distance. Men who could not have looked at that beach and misjudged whether the animal stood in front of the post or behind it, because judging that is the entire content of their working lives. And every one of them, in every fragment of testimony that survives, said the same thing about the shape, that it went up, not lay, went up, on legs. The second is the running. A seal on land moves in a heaving caterpillar lurch, and it cannot cover ground. Whatever was on that beach, according to the man who stood closest to it, crossed 40 yards of driftwood and shingle faster than a man could, and left the sand behind it, and the sand is the one part of this I cannot argue away with a lens and a bit of geometry, because prints are not a matter of perspective. So I come back to the plate, to the grey rectangle and the low sun off to the left, and the driftwood in the near ground, and the pale mass standing where the wet sand begins, to the neck at its heron angle, and the small dark head, and the flank that goes on and on with no seam in it, to a photograph that a careful man looked at under a loupe for an hour and could not make into a bird, and that another careful man looked at and could not make into anything else. Ferrier died in 1974. The last of the survey party had gone 20 years before him. The plate is not located, and I do not think it will be. What is left is a description, initialed twice by draftsmen who did not want to sign a loan, and a figure written down in a Wellington office in the last week of October 1919, and a beach that is still there, that you could stand on tomorrow, where the driftwood still comes up in the same lines and the same low sun comes in off the water, 2.5 meters at the shoulder, no wing. If it was a seal, why did 4 surveyors, men who measure for a living, all say it stood up and walked?